This is Friday, October 30th, 2020. American Government. Monday we'll turn to Wilson and Chapter 11. Today we're discussing the last aspect of the executive branch, the presidency, really more than the presidency, and that is the bureaucracy. I entitled this in my notes, the fourth branch of government, as some people call it, because as you'll see, there's some question as to whether or not the way that the federal administrative establishment, the bureaucracy, is developed is in accord with constitutional principles and the constitutional system. In some ways, it's the same issue as with the party system, those aspects of our government that grew up since the time of the founding. So we'll look at constitutional principles and original intentions, explore the development of the bureaucracy, and look at some of the issues and criticisms. As Wilson suggests, Americans have a love-hate relationship with the largest part of the federal government. Again, in some ways, this is like Congress, and as you'll see, just as with reforming the presidency and with Congress for that matter, sometimes there's a partisan basis to this question of whether you love or hate the federal bureaucracy. Many Americans want to expand the size and scope and power of the administrative components of the national government. For instance, almost all proposals for expanding healthcare and access to healthcare coverage, almost always require an expansion of the federal administrative establishment. At the same time, that they fear its immensity and control over their lives, and its apparent indifference and perceived lack of control by the elected parts of the government. And that's the question we'll investigate at the end of this discussion. By the bureaucracy, what we're calling the bureaucracy, and it would be useful if you have the chart of the executive branch that I sent out last week, and also I believe I attached it this week, and it's also on Canvas. We mean the bulk of the executive branch below the political top, roughly the 2 or 3% of the top underneath the President, White House office, and executive office of the presidency, those administrative supervisory units that were added to the White House and executive branch at and after World War II, and the layer of political appointees, roughly 2,000 to 3,000, depending on the presidency and the administration, that the president approves by and with consent of the Senate, and the very top crust of the executive branch that still is governed by the patronage system, or that we'll discuss later, and essentially is understood to be a political extension of the president. So if you look at that chart, plus, by the way, so this includes then the bulk of the executive branch that forms the base of the pyramid, the roughly 2 to 3 million employees of the 15 different executive departments, including the Department of Defense. It also includes the independent regulatory agencies, and we'll discuss those, why those are called independent regulatory agencies. And you'll notice that in the diagram, I tried to encapsulate its character in a strikingly appropriate and descriptive picture. I put them outside the pyramid of the executive branch because, as you're going to see, some people raise the question of where they belong constitutionally. They are appointed, typically, they tend to be panels of anywhere from 5 to 7 or more individuals, depending on the regulatory agency. They're appointed by the president, by and with the advising consent of the Senate, as you'll see. But often their tenure is structured so that they can't be easily removed and therefore controlled by the president, which is why they're called independent regulatory agencies, like the FAA, the Federal Aviation Authority, the Federal Communications Commission, the Interstate Commerce Commission, etc. So we should remember, and the Wilson text actually brings an important point, that one distinctive feature of the American bureaucratic structure is what Wilson describes as proxy agencies, or proxy by government, where many aspects of federal programs, even if they're ultimately supervised by the um, the executive branch or the bureaucracy, actual members of the federal government. There are many functions that are parceled out to um, or farmed out to private companies, non-governmental profit institutions, um, and even under certain circumstances, religious groups. Certain kinds of federal urban assistance programs are actually administered and supervised by um, churches and or religious organizations. That's something of a unique feature, and we'll see why that is. It has to do in some ways with certain aspects of American government and the constitutional system. And in particular, we'll see that this is connected with the notion of limited government in the constitutional system and the enumeration of powers in Article 1, Section 8. The idea, in other words, that government, especially the national government's functions, are listed, limited, and should be confined as much as possible. That assumption doesn't exist in other nations. The assumption of limited government, therefore, in some ways, as a percentage of their governing institutions, uh, their structures and bureaucracies are probably much more formal and much more official. So that's what we call the bureaucracy. And I should point out that all complex and extensive governments in history, the Roman Empire, the Chinese Empire, all empires, you might say, and all modern governments, by that I mean essentially, as you'll see when we discuss the development of the bureaucracy, all modern governments that uh, uh, since the middle of the 1900s, you could say that in Europe, uh, the bureaucratic state, of course, all modern governments, even going back into the 16th, 17th centuries, had extensive bureaucracies, often for police purposes. The police state, the Tsar in Russia, had an extensive police apparatus that was bureaucratic in its structure. The Bourbon kings prior to the French Revolution, and on the continent, probably um, the most famous development of consolidation of political power, structure, and government on the continent was Bismarck in the 1870s German Constitution, who was often considered to be the founder of the modern expansive welfare state and economic regulatory state. So all complex governments have bureaucratic structures, uh, uh, and to some degree, they all rely upon these structures as the means of effecting their policies and carrying out the governing of masses of million human beings, which is another aspect of modern government. The population of the human race has gone from 1 billion at the beginning of 1900 to about 8 billion now. So uh, all modern governments that engage in the complex scope of government and expanding scope of government in the modern world, and also govern over millions of human beings, require bureaucratic structures. The word bureaucracy comes from bureau, le long français, the French word for office, and kratie, which comes from the Greek word kratia, which means to rule, like demokratia, democracy. Demos is the Greek word for people, so demokratia, democracy, is the rule of the people. Aristokratia, aristocracy, is the rule of the best. Aristos is the Greek word for best. So bureaucracy is kind of a modern coinage, and it means the rule of the offices or officers. And in some ways, in the last century, the classic definition and description, scholarly but also quite interesting, um, um, of bureaucracy can be found in the essay of the same name by the German sociologist, one of the considered to be one of the founders of modern sociology, Max Weber. Essentially, he defined bureaucracy as a complex, hierarchical organization with legally defined functions staffed and run by experts who specialize in their particular area of policy controlled, supposedly, by the political parts of the regime. In some ways, Weber thought that bureaucracy was the most rational and efficient structure of government because it relied upon clearly defined functions, experts appointed to their particular expertise, and controlled hierarchically like a military organization. Um, but it must be said that there's a sober character to Weber's essay because he thought there were also other and many of the advantages to bureaucratic government that I just listed, because if you're having a complex structure divided by function and hierarchically arranged, it has a tendency to divide issues up according to the different natural divisions in the issue and assigning those different aspects of an issue or a policy to people who specialize in that area. So um, Weber thought that, again, the main advantages are certain regularity, procedure, a certain ability to concentrate expertise and function at the appropriate level and on the appropriate task. But he also thought that bureaucracies are also liable to intrinsic pathologies, such as discussed below. And for instance, Weber thought that it was always that through control, the hierarchical control, even though it looks good on paper, uh, Weber argued that oftentimes there's a disjunction of information between the lower parts of the bureaucracy and the upper parts because it has to move up through the official structure. Um, and Wilson, in Chapter 11, discusses five of these different kinds of bureaucratic pathologies. And Weber even thought that as modern government proceeded and became more comprehensive and complex, that bureaucratic structures might actually undermine representative or popularly controlled governments. And as again, the growing complexity and scope and power of government seem to be inevitable in the modern world. I suppose we can discuss that in its most general aspects. But we'll look at all of these questions about whether these pathologies that are often at the heart of Americans' misgivings about the bureaucracy uh, uh, and the different criticisms that are made. I think in seeing it overall in terms of the founding to today, the framers anticipated clearly something like bureaucracy, or at least in their view, a well organized and competent administration, supervised by the energetic executive, the presidency. So that's why I put this subject under the presidency, because to some degree, the question of the administration of government, which of course the articles produce a terrible administration because A, there was no executive branch. And even though under the Congress, under the articles, a kind of an administrative structure began to develop, part of the constitutional reform of 1787 to 89 was to create an effective administrative structure, supervised again by a single, competent, energetic, responsible executive. So, whether or not the massive structures that we have governing us today, or at least affecting the business of government on a day to day level, um, whether or not those structures are the embodiment of or a departure from the intentions of the framers will also raise that question. So, the most distinctive aspects of American bureaucracy, as opposed to other modern nations, have to do with the constitutional context. As Wilson points out, and as we've seen with Chapter 9 on Congress, Chapter 10 on the presidency, um, um, the unique feature of our constitutional system is the separation of powers on the national level. And to some degree, that means that whereas in a parliamentary system, because the parliament then elects the executive and the prime minister and the other ministers of the department come from the parliament, there's more of a fused responsibility. The sense of who's the masters of the bureaucracy in parliamentary systems tends to be more clear. But and so the most striking feature about our federal executive branch is that even though the president is the constitutional head and does exert a good deal of influence, as Kennedy says in his essay on leadership, administrative leadership, over the executive branch, especially the political parts of it, there's this other branch out there, Congress. And as we'll see when we come to the question of political checking of the bureaucracy or supervision of the bureaucracy, the separation of powers is both messier and perhaps more efficient in terms of keeping unelected bureaucrats attentive to the public purpose, insofar as you require them to look beyond their specific official function. Um, so that's the most striking thing on the national level is the bureaucracy has two masters. And when you consider, by the way, and we'll get to the judiciary in the next couple of weeks, when you consider that the judicial branch also and the judiciary regularly supervises issues within the bureaucracy, you could actually say all three branches of government provide some kind of supervision and control. Um, And of course, you'll see when we turn to checks and controls on the bureaucracy, congressional oversight itself, just by Congress, since Congress is a complex and sprawling institution, um, uh, uh, the way that the bureaucracy is held accountable to political control, again, is much messier, but perhaps more effective. How can somebody both messy and effective? I don't know. Perhaps as a teacher, I'm messy and effective, but that's not for me to judge. Um, the other aspect of our constitutional system that influences the way our federal bureaucracy works is federalism, and as I mentioned earlier, the enumerated and limited powers of the government in Article 1, Section 8, from remember from your review of the Constitution, and also um, to some degree the importance and semi-sovereignty of the states. Um, so, so the edifice looks unified in some ways, although I guess the chart of my chart of the executive branch doesn't exactly look unified. Um, but but a good deal of government, remember, is reserved to the states, and therefore that partially explains this proxy character of the American bureaucracy. Um, again, uh, the American political tradition begins with a sense of limited government, especially on the national level. The government can only exercise those powers that are granted to it. Now, it's true, those 17, 18, if you count the necessary and proper clause in Article 1, Section 8, to be sure, and as government has expanded, as the role of the United States as a foreign and military power has expanded, clearly um, the those 18 enumerated powers have been interpreted quite flexibly. So, for instance, the national government has a vast and sprawling Department of Education, which it isn't explicitly grounded in the separation of powers, but because of the flexible interpretation of those powers in McCulloch v. Maryland that we saw by Chief Justice Marshall in 1819, the federal government has had a pretty expansive growth, and those powers are interpreted flexibly. Nevertheless, the core idea is that Americans don't want government eventually to absorb uh, uh, and supervise and control all their lives, all aspects of their lives, uh, and to some degree that's reflected in the federal structure, which again tries to keep the federal apparatus limited in its scope and function. And that means important aspects of bureaucratic functioning that in other countries would be simply part of the official structure are left, as I said earlier, to the states or to even private companies, nonprofits, and other entities discussed in that section on proxy government. So that's the core structure of our, and you could say political assumptions and features of our system that give this kind of distinctive feature to American bureaucratic operation. So let's look at the historical evolution of the bureaucracy, and um, and this will both highlight the major chronological developments, but also the major thematic developments. And as you'll see, to some degree, the growth of bureaucracy parallels in some ways the structure and growth of the party system, which we've already looked at. And of course, all this begins with the founding. Now, as I said earlier, the framers created the Constitution partially in order to create an effective, strong national administration. Um, and to some degree, Washington and other presidents prior to the rise of the party system saw their presidential role as picking appropriately competent individual subject to presidential control and to some degree on a nonpartisan basis. As I said, in Washington's first cabinet, he deliberately chose Hamilton, whom he knew to be an expansive national government interpreter, and Jefferson, whom he knew to have quite different views of constitutional powers in the national government. So you'd have to say that also at the time of the founding, the relative scope and size of the federal bureaucracy or administration was pretty tiny. Um, After the Articles of Confederation ceased to operate, which was left over as about 800 and mostly unpaid soldiers in the Continental Army and a Secretary of State and Treasury, I think, by the end of the period, So the framers created the Constitution with the presidency in the first Congress. Five different executive departments were created, headed by secretaries, indeed that was pretty much the structure of government. Now, as you'll see, the next major step in the development of the bureaucracy, and by the way, that's why the size and scope, because the federal government's functions were relatively limited at that time, and so the structure that embodied those limited functions was relatively small. By the 1820s, as we've seen before, the party system had pretty much become the glue that held the different parts of the system together. And indeed, as the federal bureaucracy began to expand and the party system grew, the next development in our bureaucratic structure was what's often called the patronage or the spoils system. And this especially begins with the rise of two-party competition under the Jackson administration, whose vice president, if you remember, was Martin Van Buren, the founder, more or less, of the two-party system. And the patronage system, the spoil system, was an intrinsic part of the American party system as it grew. Um, the reason it's called the spoil system is the old adage that to the victor belong the spoils. And the argument is that federal administrative appointments, executive appointments, should be made on the basis of party affiliation, and that the president's party, um, when the president is elected and comes into office, that the president should appoint people of his party to the federal bureaucracy so that uh, that he can exercise a more direct control over them. And the reason this is often called a patronage system is because federal office holding was seen as a kind of patronage for people that supported the system and worked for congressmen and senators of the party, and even for the president, to reward them for their service to the party by giving them a federal job. Um, and if you've ever read The Scarlet Letter and the Custom House preface, that's part of what Hawthorne is satirizing in that part of um, the uh, the Scarlet Letter, because remember, it's autobiographical in that little customs house section because he was a federal official appointed for patronage reasons. So again, this was a way of granting members of Congress a certain influence over the administration, because oftentimes individuals that worked for the party election of a member of the House or Senate, the the member of Congress would then approach the executive branch with its list of patronage appointees. And that was an important source of members of Congress as both representatives and senators' power. And you have to see that to some degree, the theoretical rationale for this was democratic control. As in other words, as the people chose in these two broad shifts between two parties, then that should somehow be reflected in the way in the bureaucratic and administrative assumptions of the members of the executive branch. And that's still a part of our governmental structure, at least at the top in that pyramid. Again, the top 2 to 3%, or some people would say about 2 to 3 thousand appointees, are political in the sense that they tend to come and go with the administration based on partisan reasons. And again, that's still an important part of our sense of popular or political or democratic control of members of the executive branch, who are again appointed and not elected. Now, this theory worked. I won't say it worked fine, because there were always complaints about inefficiency, uh, people who were not expert in a function being appointed to being incompetent in their area, and instability in the executive branch. But it's with the growth of the size and scope and function of the executive branch, as Wilson points out in in the Civil War. For instance, the three massive agencies that expanded were of course, the Department of Defense, because of the necessity of supervising and conducting the war effort, just the size of the army, but then also the Department of Veterans afterwards. I mean, 750,000 soldiers were killed on both sides, by the way, and the orphans and widows were all superintended by the Veterans Affairs, and then the Freedmen's Bureau was the primary supervisory reconstruction entity that also expanded the scope of the federal government. So, so in some ways, the issue that the war brings up, or even not just the war, but the growth of the nation from both coasts to the entire continent. And as we'll see, the increasing scope of government. By the end of the Civil War, the federal executive branch was a little over 100,000 people, and by the end of the 19th century, it was about 200,000 people. That's a lot of people to suddenly wipe out and replace in election every 4 years. And by then, the inefficiencies, corruptions, and instability of this system began to compile so much that in 1883, and this is the decisive turning point in the rise of the modern federal bureaucracy, was the creation of the civil service system, or sometimes called the merit system for reasons we'll see in a minute, and as Wilson discusses this in Chapter 11. And this is primarily through the Pendleton Act of 1883. What what did the Pendleton Act do, and how did that set the stage for modern bureaucracy? It's often called a merit system because whereas in the patronage system or spoil system, a person was hired or fired simply because of party affiliation and party support, the merit system is called such because um, essentially there are two principles involved. Hiring by merit, which is to say, based on demonstrated competency and expertise in a specific function, that notion of bureaucracy that we talked about with Weber. So, hiring by merit and firing by cause. And cause means either essentially incompetence or inability to perform the specific job or function or office that you're appointed to, or malfeasance like illegality or immorality or something like that. Um, and as you're going to see, one of the bureaucratic pathologies that we'll talk about is how hard it is to get rid of bad federal executive branch employees under this system. But you have to see, to some degree, that was intended in the system. It's pretty easy to dispense of to fire people based on party affiliation, and to argue that you could only be fired if you did something wrong or you couldn't do your job. That means it puts the burden of proof, of course, on the governing structures. So, to some degree, those two aspects of hiring by merit based on competence and expertise, measured by competitive exams, and to some degree, this embodied this hierarchical notion, and that's why I appended this in 2017. The GS system, the General Service System, which is the ranking of the executive branch beneath the political branches, is ranked by salary, scope, and function. And as you'll see, it goes up. My mother, after my father passed away in 1975, my father was a veteran, and my mother, as a widow of a veteran, took the civil service exam and was awarded 10 points as a widow. And she went to work as a government clerk accountant in the Department of Defense in the Rock Island Arsenal. So she was part of that pyramid. And so the idea is that as your responsibilities went up in the hierarchy, your job description was set and expanded, and you were tested for it, your salary would also go up. My mother was a GS5 when she worked for the government, and you can locate where that was. Now that was 2017. My mother was in the federal government from 1975 to about 1990. But but anyway, that's why it's called a merit system. Uh, uh, the integrity of this system was the law also created an entity to supervise the civil service called the Civil Service Commission that would supervise the testing and placement and also firing of individuals. Um, and this structure existed up until the 1970s when President Carter instituted some important executive administrative reforms, including the splitting up of the Civil Service Commission into two separate agencies: the Merit Protection Board, which is the institution um, that supervises the firing, and the Office of Personnel Management, which superintends the structure of competitive exams. Uh, Originally, only a tiny part of the federal government was under the civil service system, but over the century and a half, it's been expanded. So, as you'll see, that's the core. That's most of the federal government. So most of the executive branch is technically beyond the political control of either Congress or the president. Um, but again, that depends on the issue, the function, and the level of government. So The other major development historically, structurally, in the late 1880s up through frankly, the modern era, and which got a boost in during the Depression and the New Deal, was the rise of the independent regulatory agencies. Um, and starting with the Interstate Commerce Commission, I believe in the 1880s, I think 1888, I could be wrong about the date. Um, um, and the interesting thing about the independent regulatory agencies is these agencies are created to combine legislative, executive, and judicial functions. They actually they take their specific area. The ICC, the Interstate Commerce Commission, for instance, looked at regulating the trains and interstate commerce, and is the major body that still issues regulations about like trucking limitations on national roads, weight limitations. Like you often see these giant trailer, semi-trailer trucks. Those are all regulated by the ICC, and so to call them, it means that again they have some rulemaking function. They also have executive hearings and make administrative judgments on parties before them, and they even have some judicial functions. The Securities and Exchange Commissions that supervises the financial markets can impose fines and not criminal punishments but administrative punishments. So the interesting thing about these agencies is they seem to combine all three powers of government, and since they're called independent, because again, generally speaking, that independence is secured by the president appointing with the Senate, but then oftentimes there's a 5 to 7 year term, and they're not removable by the president. So they're appointed typically by the president or other members of the executive branch, but they're not simply subject to their control because they can't be removed except for cause, like the civil service. So um, um, the question from the beginning of these is, well, what branch of government are they? Some people still argue, although pretty much the constitutionality of these entities has been accepted in a century and a half, and they do perform critical functions of government. But some people argue that the whole point of the Constitution was to separate these functions out and to make sure that these functions are accountable within their particular branch. So, what part of the government are they? They are technically part of the executive branch, but they're not simply part of the executive branch structure and control under the president. Some people still make this criticism, and it's not clear where this may go in the future. Part of this depends upon, again, what Americans want from their government, and even potentially the partisan direction of the government. Um, so, as Wilson points out, it's uh, the forces that led to the expansion of the federal government um, were various and stretched all the way from, as we already mentioned, the um, the Civil War, but also, as I also mentioned, the expansion of the country geographically, um, uh, and the rise of national commerce and the economy and corporate capitalism. Um, and to carry through Wilson's narrative, World War I was a massive expansion of the Department of Defense and the expansion of the U.S.'s role in foreign affairs. Um, and and obviously World War II and the rise of the Cold War and the rise of the intelligence establishment, the CIA, the NSA, and so forth, um, the State Department. But of course, the Depression and the New Deal were probably the most important domestic uh, uh, um, uh, instigators or causes of this expansion. Um, with the turn of the century, government's role in regulating the economy, which was growing itself more complex, which is one of the reasons that led to the independent regulatory agencies that we saw. Um, but then also the rise of the modern welfare state under the New Deal, first with the Social Security system, and then also with Great Society programs in the 1960s under Lyndon Johnson, with Medicare and Medicaid and aid to welfare function of supporting families and et cetera. So, I mean, all of these factors over the last century and a half have led to the expansion of the scope, the activity, the size, and power of the federal establishment. Um, and uh, Wilson has a nice chart on page 228 that charts the growth of the size, the personnel, the regulatory activity. And by the way, each branch of the government has its own official documentary record. Article 1, Section 5 talks about Congress keeping a record, and of course, the congressional record is the primary documentary, and plus the committee hearings, reports, and everything. But the congressional record is the primary document that chronicles Congress of all their debates and votes and everything, although it can be selectively edited by members of Congress. Uh, but nevertheless, it constitutes a record of Congress's activity. In the judicial branches, we'll see the Supreme Court reports are the official record of court decisions and opinions. And in the executive branch, the Federal Register is the comprehensive accounting of all federal rules and regulations formulated by the executive branch. And you can tell from that chart that it's grown in massive scope. Some at points over 50,000 pages would be added a year to the Federal Register. And one other development, which we've already looked at from the standpoint of Congress, is the rise of the Washington establishment. Iron triangles, if you remember, we discussed this with the Fiorina article. Um, and with special interest in the populace kind of feeding congressional reelection, which creates the bureaucracy and bureaucratic programs, which then also feed on their power and privilege. And the that Washington establishment partisan designation, has called it the swamp, has its own pathologies to some degrees we've already seen. So that's where we are. We are now supervised and administered by this vast apparatus, which controls ever more important parts of our lives. But as Fiorino points out, and as Wilson points out, primarily because Americans have come to demand more services, more Americans have gradually turned themselves into clients of governmental services. To some degree, that's the relationship between citizen and government in almost all modern governments. Um, whether the relative constitutional democracies of Western Europe and other parts of the world versus the vast, sprawling, bureaucratic, uh, centralized state, supervisory state of the Communist Party in the People's Republic of China or in Korea. So, um, what are the kinds of criticisms and reforms that people make and suggest? Well, again, look on pages 224 to 225, where Wilson discusses these 5 typical kinds of bureaucratic pathologies. You all know what the expression red tape means. You have to go from office to office getting official stamps on different parts, and then you can't get one thing done in one office because the functions are separated. And he discusses the origin of the phrase red tape. So all those bureaucratic procedures that you have to navigate if you want something done. All you have to do is stand in line at the Department of Motor Vehicles, even on the state level, to realize how pleasant that is. Since the bureaucracy is so sprawling and government encompasses different functions, and bureaucrats often become territorial, it's interesting that the next 3, conflict, duplication, and imperialism, means that probably in these complex structures, you're going to end because of the necessity of dividing up by function. You're going to get some duplication of effort, and to some degree, the creation of one of the largest branches now since 9/11. And Wilson points out that was one of the influences 9/11 affected the government, the creation of the Department of Homeland Security, which was an attempt to eliminate some of this duplication, conflict, and imperialism by consolidating many of these different agencies under one executive department. So, and then the other major pathology is waste, because so little accountable, because these unaccountable bureaucrats often set prices when they bid for things and services and everything. And Wilson talks about the different scandals about an $800 toilet seat in the department in the Army in the 1980s. So uh, these are, as as Weber suggested in his essay on bureaucracy, these are probably, they'd simply go with the territory. If you want bureaucratic government, you're probably going to have some degree of these pathologies. And so, in some ways, the question of whether or not the existence and containment of these pathologies partially depends upon the kinds of checks on bureaucratic independence and discretion that exist in our system. And as we already saw earlier, that's the system of separation of powers and checks and balances, and in some ways the political culture that's grown up in our country. And I think that you could say that there are at least four major external factors or forces outside the bureaucracy that check and limit the power and scope and discretion of the bureaucracy. One is, of course, presidential control. And one of the whole themes of President Trump's election and administration is he sort of declared himself at war with many aspects of the permanent bureaucracy, which he called the swamp or the deep state. And again, there's obviously some partisan tinge to this, but there's no question that the president does, as Kennedy suggests in his essay on the four kinds of leadership. The president is the constitutional head of the executive branch, certainly controls it at the top to some degree, uh, and even on certain aspects of policy has a direct and immediate influence on all parts of the executive branch. Um, and of course, Wilson has an extensive discussion of the overall function of congressional oversight. And, and this means two things. We already looked at Congress. Where does this occur? It occurs on the committee level. Each of the 22 committees and standing committees in the House and 16 in the Senate all correspond to various aspects of the executive branch. And in committee hearings and reports, and the Congressional Research Service, the massive research institute, and in the General Accounting Office, um, there's constant supervision and control of different offices and branches and even individual bureaucrats. And if you remember in the Fiorina article and also in the Wilson article, a major function of modern members of Congress is constituency service. Uh, if for some reason the Department of Social Security isn't processing your check fast enough, you can approach your congressman and they can intervene. Um, remember, bureaucrats, as Fiorina and Weber might suggest, they want as little interference from uh, the outside as they can manage, and many see congressional reports and committee hearings and individual intrusions by members of Congress as a nuisance, but nevertheless that does help check and supervise that discretion. Um, there's a long discussion, and we'll come back to this on Monday when we talk about domestic policy, about the legislative process in Congress. And Wilson points out an important thing that's not discussed so much in the chapter on Congress, and that is all legislation and governmental programs go through a two-step process in the Congress called authorization. And that's where the specific committees, like the Agriculture Committee or the Foreign Affairs Committee, um, the authorization stage is when the bill is passed, the program is created and authorized, and then the next stage is called the appropriation stage, and this is true in the House and Senate. So so the authorization stage creates programs, their authority, their scope, their et cetera, their potential funding, but then the appropriations committees and the budget committees in both houses then actually make the spending decisions. And we'll talk about the budget process on Monday. But but to some degree, that keeps a check on administrative discretion because administrators have to come back to Congress both to have their authority reauthorized and their funding reappropriated. Not, and you'll see that one problem is that that process of authorization and appropriation, that large portions of federal government are now what are called entitlement programs, which are refunded automatically. In some respects, stand outside this formal process. Nevertheless, this is a check on the way bureaucracies operate. And last, you'd have to say that American adversarial culture, as Wilson describes it, but then the publicity and the press structure of the First Amendment. Americans have the right to free speech and press, and to some degree, the growth of the media as an establishment has helped to supervise and check because to some degree, uh, newspapers and television stations and even internet sites, they're constantly have their eye on different aspects of federal policy, and oftentimes, if you watch the presidential debates, these issues of what they detect in the administration come up for public discussion. So there are massive external entities, the president, the Congress, interest groups and lobbyists, but also the media, which stand outside the bureaucratic structure of government and supervise it, if not always control it. So that leads us to our big question then. Uh, are we run by, has the bureaucracy escaped constitutional control? Are we run by unelected masters, as some critics would say? Are we controlled by the deep state that's beyond any political control or responsibility? As I suggest, there's always more than one side of these issues. And the federal bureaucracy is, let's face it, is vast. It's difficult to scrutinize and supervise. It does possess massive realms of discretion over growing parts of American life. And as Americans demand more services and functions from the government, this growth in scope, power, and function and unscrutability is likely to increase. Some political scientists and scholars suggest that the overall effects of the expansion of bureaucracy is to contribute stability and expertise to American government. The purposes behind civil service reform in the 1880s. And in some ways, the argument is in the same way that the judiciary is non-elected and stable and it is an element of stability and continuity in the constitutional system, that the federal bureaucracy performs somewhat of the same functions, and that it's a restraint on the unstable and popularly driven politicians who come and go. The problem is those unstable, often ignorant and self-interested and popularly driven politicians are the main mechanism of Republican responsibility in a constitutional republic. Um, and by our constitutional system, they are the final masters of the bureaucracy. So, my guess is, as Americans want more government but fear more bureaucracy, and as we maintain the basic structures of our constitutional system, we'll probably be discussing and disputing this issue for a long time.